If you're a clinical psychologist, you don't want to steal people's accomplishments from them, which is partly why you don't give advice exactly. So maybe someone is trying to decide whether they should get married, and maybe you have an opinion, but probably you shouldn't, because as a psychologist, let's say, because except perhaps in extreme cases, the person has to discover what they need to do for themselves so that they can discover it again in the future, so that they can learn to discover things for themselves. And you don't want to give advice, because then if they do something good, you can take credit for it. And I don't want to take credit for the accomplishments that people make as a consequence of, what would you say, putting the ideas they encounter in my books into practice. They put them into practice, and good for them. And so when I meet people in the street, that's what I tell them. It's like, okay, you did this specific thing, good for you. And, I provided some impetus, and I'm happy about that and pleased to do that, but I certainly don't want the credit. But I do feel the obligation. I think it is part of what made me ill. I think it is because, as a psychologist, I dealt with people's innermost secrets for decades. But it was kind of limited, right? It was 13 people or so a week, maybe up to 20, which is still quite a few people, but it's not an inordinate number of people. It's a bounded number of people. And then I had my other work that I could escape into, let's say, and I wasn't carrying it with me, the burden of the lives of the people that I was intertwined with. But then all of a sudden I started to experience that the longing, I suppose, in some sense, on a much greater scale, and that's been difficult to digest. The misery, and that's so common in people's lives, but even worse than that, the degree to which it requires almost nothing to rectify it in an important way. There's many people who are starving for a word of encouragement, and if you provide that, they run with it, and that's great, but it also reveals this terrible unnecessary lack. It's like, well, why weren't they encouraged to begin with? And that's a deep hole to fall down, and because you can never stop answering that question once you start asking it. And it has something to do with the fundamental difficulty that everyone who's human has in valuing their own existence because of its imperfections and finitude. And it's a very complex question. And then to see that played out thousands of times, these brief encounters I have with people, they're very intense. People tell me things in those encounters that they don't tell anyone else, or they tell very few people, or maybe they've never told anyone in their life. This young man stopped me on the street the other day, and he was looking a bit beat up. And he came up and he said, he was very shy, and he said, well, your lectures have been very helpful. And I asked him what his name was, and that usually helps people set them at ease. And then I said, well, what helped you? And he was quite hesitant. He didn't exactly know how to formulate what he was doing, but I could see that he was very scared to say anything that he had done well, because his experience had been that he'd never been encouraged when he did something well. And so, you can really punish someone if they come up to you and say they did something good that was actually good, and then you punish them or ignore them. It really hurts them. And that happens to children all the time. And it certainly had happened to this young man. So he's very hesitant to tell me what he had done that was good. And, he told me, and I listened, and I said, look, this is, as far as I'm concerned, that what you did was really good. And he just lit up, and that's great that he lit up, but it's terrible that it hadn't happened to him before. It's really terrible. And then I see this tied in with a cultural pathology, that a variety of cultural pathologies that are manifesting themselves at the current time. The idea that organized masculine activity is by definition some kind of power-centered tyranny, and the corollary that any sort of ambition on the part of young men any ambition towards achievement is somehow integrally tied up with tyrannical power. It's so demoralizing for young men. They don't know how to defend themselves against that. And the idea, and it's often leveled, the accusation is often leveled by people who've never had a relationship with a male in their life that was actually fulfilling and worthwhile. And then that all plays out in the public domain. It's really awful to see. And I can see it. So it's hard. It's hard to see that. I mean, I'm thrilled that I am in a position to do something about it. It's so great. That's something else I can tell people now too, because you say, well, what should you do with your life? And like, I've seen people who've accomplished anything that you can imagine in terms of accomplishments. And I can say clearly that I've never seen anything as rewarding as the consequences of forthright speech, the opportunity to be of genuine service to other people. There's way more reward in that than in any of the things that people chase in a more finite and limited way.
Like I have a painting in my office called Dead Mentors. It's me in the painting with 8 other characters in a vault. We're having a conversation. It's a debate between 2 books, Communist Manifesto and Atlas Shrugged. So it's a discourse. They're having a debate, they're having a discourse. It's very interesting characters, but you can tap into somebody. You're like, okay, I can tap into.
Who are the characters? Who are the characters in the painting?
I just moved to Florida. So I got John F. Kennedy, I got Einstein, I got the Shah of Iran, Lincoln, MLK, Tupac, Ayrton Senna, Milton Friedman, and one other character I'm forgetting.
Great. So that's so good, because look, and you can surround yourself with these great minds, and you can what would you say, in some sense, you can choose them as your peers voluntarily, dead or not, right? It's a form of ancestor worship in some sense, and I mean that in a deep sense. And you can do that's one of the advantages of that is education, as far as I'm concerned, is pick your peers. And this instinct we have to find someone to admire, that's the deepest of religious instincts, and it's unbelievably deep in human beings. And and we have this mimicry, this capacity for mimicry that's an integral part of our cognitive architecture, and it's the precursor to thought. And we do identify, you notice you would. Someone, that is the instinct to mimic, because to admire is then to want to be that, and that's the action of the moral instinct. It finds a target in the world and it says, well, I could be like that. But at first it says, this person is attractive, or this person is compelling. It grabs you, and that's the instinct for further development. It's a very positive thing. It can be a very positive thing.
When you were going through your moment the last 12 months, who were you saying, at least he overcame it, I can, here's what he went through was worse, was there anybody you would go to?
Well, there has been throughout my life all sorts of intellectual figures from my own life as well. I found many things about my father extremely admirable, and still do, my mother as well. And so I was fortunate to have people in my immediate environment who played that role for me, and that's a huge gift. I have all sorts of intellectual idols, I would say, and there are people whose work I've read deeply, and that's been extremely useful to me. And then that shade. the consideration of religious figures at some point. And I've spent a lot of time studying religious thinking and trying to, what religious thinking is in some sense is the collective attempt to specify the ideal for mimicry. So imagine that you have those 8 figures in your painting. So imagine there's something about each of those people that you found compelling and admirable. So then imagine that you could abstract out from that what was compelling and admirable and make one person out of that was sort of the union of all those 8. It was everything good about those 8 people brought into one person. Well, that's approaching a divine figure. And when you hear Christian statements, for example, like Christ is the King of Kings, that actually means something technical from a psychological perspective. What it means is that, and I'm not speaking in religious terms here precisely, although it shades into the religious, is that a religious ideal is in fact the abstracted representation of what is admirable. Such, and it's extremely useful to have that made into an abstraction to some degree too, because it also means that you then have something that you're responsible to. So let's say and you've done this with your painting, you have these 8 people who you're now what would you say, you're responsible to them, you're accountable to them, you're accountable to their spirit. And so now your conscience can speak with their collective voice, and it can tell you when you're less than you could be. And then you can use that to guide you to manifest that spirit that's embodied in those 8 people. And that's a pathway to further growth.